Hello, welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin Tizik. Today, I'm joined by Dan Kalmar, who is our creative director of written content here at Testimonial Hero. Dan came over a few months back as part of our acquisition of Upshot and has helped produce thousands of written case studies over the years. So of course, we're discussing all things case study. So we talk about whether or not case studies are dead, how to create a memorable story, and also how to use written content throughout your entire go-to-market. On to the episode. Hey, Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dustin.
No, thanks for joining me. It's I always like when I can have someone from our team on the podcast. It's a nice little switch up here.
Does it feel like cheating a little bit though to have somebody internal?
A little bit. It's a little bit easier. Yeah, but it's okay. Sometimes you got to cheat.
That's true.
So yeah, I mean, I want to start. It's kind of an interesting one because I've talked about case studies a lot on here. Sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a not positive way. So, question I want to start with you is: are case studies dead?
I think they're dead. No, I think we've had kind of similar paths with, bashing case studies in certain lights. So, I mean, for me, a bit of my background is before I joined Testimonial Hero, I came from Upshot, which was part of Influitive, where we did first-person customer stories. So, I mean, we also did the kind of more traditional challenge, solution, result case studies, but really what our bread and butter were those first-person stories that were written from the perspective of your peers. And I think part of it is, you don't ask a barber if you need a haircut. I think it was a little bit of, I have a thing I have to sell. So I think for a long time, I really championed against more traditional case studies. But I think really what I was championing against was an idea of just bad case studies. I think I so often talk to marketers who just view case studies as a box to check. And when we actually get into it, and I ask them, like, do you actually like your case studies? Like, are you proud of your case studies? The answer is usually no. And it's just kind of baffling to me that it's like, well, why are you putting out stuff that you don't like? So I think, like, when I talk about, case studies being dead, I think I'm talking about those bad case studies that are really just a company talking about themselves. Like, they aren't true customer stories. Like, to me, a lot of people use case studies and customer stories interchangeably, and I think I do too from an SEO perspective, because a lot of people just think of them as case studies. But to me, there's kind of a philosophical difference, and really what I think is dead are those more traditional case studies where it's just you talking about yourself. It's not really a customer story. It's not really true advocacy, and I think that there's a way to do case studies differently, and I don't think those are dead.
Yeah, I think those customer or company focused ones are really hard to relate to. As well. And honestly, I don't trust them half the time because I've been on the other end. I've been in marketing for 10, 12 years now. I know I write the quote and the customer approves it, right? Like I've seen that side and how it works. So that's always been my issue. Whereas if it's a relatable, like you said, if it's a relatable story, so say, I'm in a director of marketing role, it's another director of marketing talking about how it impacted their life, that I can actually relate to. So I like that differentiator between case study versus customer story. I've also created case studies I'm not proud of and was kind of forced to do because sales asked me to do them.
Yeah.
And it was just, hey, we need this new industry in this geography, go make the thing. And then they kept the PDF on their desktop.
Yeah.
And that was like the end of the story. So I'm curious there, like, okay, it's one thing to create the story, and I want to talk about that, but how do you actually use it and get value out of a case study?
It's a great question because I think you're right. What ends up happening, so I think salespeople are a big proponent of like these like more traditional ones that I don't think are very good. Like a lot of times, like I used to work at this ed tech company and everybody was educators. And anytime I was on the content team and anytime people needed a piece of content, they'd say, we need a white paper on this. And I'm like, stop saying the word white paper. You just don't know any other types of content. Like, tell me the content that you need, and then I will try to deliver something that fits that and is the best vehicle to tell that story. So I think a lot of times it's just, we have salespeople who are like, hey, I need a story that has numbers in the headline, go write this case study. And then you're right, they don't do anything with it. It doesn't enable them. So I think the first way that I like to think about this is that you need to try to get as much mileage from that interview as possible, right? So a lot of times people go into this interview and they think, I'm just going to do a video. I'm just going to do a case study. I'm going to do one of those things and that is it. And they're not thinking about, well, how do I enable different teams here to use that? And then also, how do I empower other people to consume information they want to consume, right? Because there's a lot of people out there where they're like, I would never read a case study. I just want to watch a video. But written stuff also has benefits, right? Like there's other people who want to read stuff because it's more skimmable, it's more SEO friendly, so that can help in that regard. So I think it's, one, starting by realizing that you need a lot of different types of content from that asset, that interview that you're going to do. And so starting with that in mind of, hey, we need to tell this in as many different mediums as possible. So you can't always get people on video, right? And that's always going to be a tough nut to crack. But whenever possible, video is amazing. So if you can get somebody to say yes to video, do it. Ideally at a high quality, but like even a low quality video is better than nothing. So I think it's starting with, okay, we're going to do written assets from this. We're going to do video. We're going to do long form. We're going to do short form. We can get into the specifics of that, but I think both of them are really important. But then it's also, how do I enable my different teams, right? So for sales folks, if it's like a 20-second video, they'll probably watch it. But if it's a 1,000-word case study, they're probably not going to read it. Yeah. So you then need to provide them something that makes their job easier, which is often like a sales slide, right? And like that's something that I've seen enable so many marketing teams, is putting in a little bit more effort to make this easier for sales to use. They're not going to read it, but you could give them a quick slide that they might not use externally, although ideally you should design it in a way where it could be used externally. But it's just going to give them the talking points that they need to be able to reference a whole bunch of different case studies. And then it's also about just like trying to figure out how to put it in their workflow, right? Are they using DocSend? Like, can you put this in Salesforce in a way that's really easy to search and enable them that way? Also for your social team, right? Like giving them the assets that allow this to be really plug and play for them, where they can then put this on social media, and like maybe they're doing LinkedIn ads, but even just like posting it on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, on LinkedIn, making it really easy for the right teams who should be using this stuff to use it, I think is probably the best thing you can do. Like there's so much debate around like, where do you want to put it on your site? What's the value of doing it on a third-party site versus your own? But I think you just need to really focus in on trying to tell stories in different ways in different mediums, and then enabling those key teams with the assets that they need to start working this into their workflows.
Yeah, it's funny because marketers have always done that with every other type of content.
Yeah.
Just not with case studies, right? Like everything is a campaign, and you plan out the different parts of the campaign and where things are going to go and how they're going to be distributed and all of that. But you're right, case studies just became this almost like relic from back in the day that didn't get touched, but was this necessary evil. And even for me, like it's kind of funny because we've been doing this with video forever, right? Like I create a video, I create 7 different cuts that serve different purposes. But even then, if we were doing a case study internally here, I would just do the case study and not even think the same process. So it's like this weird mental block marketers have to get through. So you mentioned, sales slides, social images, any other kind of interesting use cases that you've seen? I mean, you've worked on, 1,000, 2,000 stories. Any other kind of interesting or unique ones that customers have done?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think those are the kind of big buckets that I see people tend to use is some sort of a one-pager, so like a shorter version of the case study. And I mean, it's not always necessary, because sometimes case studies can already be quite short, but some sort of shorter version, and those can be used in different ways, right? I mean, I think sometimes they can be used as just like a shorter thing to get people into the longer story. So sometimes it's an externally facing thing, which I think is great. It's always good to have that kind of snackable teaser content to get people into longer form stuff. But sometimes people are using those as like leave behinds at events, right? Like they want to have this thing that people can take home. I don't know if people are actually taking those home and using those things, but that's something that I see people do a lot. Then yeah, I mean the sales slides I think are really great to enable sales teams. Audiograms can be an interesting thing to kind of dabble in when you. Often the use case there is that you don't have video. I think if you had the option of doing an audiogram or doing like a good, well-produced video, I would always say do the video or an audiogram. There's just something about seeing a moving face that we really relate to on a humanistic level. But if you've got some good audio, people have good clips. I think that can be another medium, especially on LinkedIn, that people like to consume because they're used to seeing it with, audiograms for podcasts and things like that. And then I think it's also just trying to think of these things more as campaigns instead of one-off things. And a lot of times you can do what you've been doing already, but just thinking about it more holistically. So one example that comes to mind that I love to share is Amplitude, is a client of ours, and they're an app analytics company, so they help people understand how to develop their products and get insights from their users. So big companies like Chick-fil-A and things like that use them. And they had this campaign that they ran called the AHA campaign, which they wanted to uncover the aha moments that people had with using Amplitude, like the things that the unexpected insights that you got from your users that you weren't expecting, hence unexpected, but that changed how you built your product. And they did this big video campaign with companies like Dropbox and Spirit Airline and Fender, the guitar company. And everything was around this theme of these aha moments. And it empowered them in a couple different ways. I think the one thing was the end result, which they were able to put up this landing page, and they did an ebook from it that kind of had like some of the best insights that people could take away. So that's like another form of content that you can do to answer your original question. But then, it had this landing page that had all these great videos, and then the written stories that our team did for them. And then, within those written stories, they had the videos as well. So there's a lot of cross-pollination there. But also, a challenge that all marketers have with trying to get people to do these stories is that first moment of like, how do we get people to say yes to this? And when people feel like they're part of this bigger campaign, that's a big reason why they say yes, right? If it's just like, hey, we need this case study it's going to sit on this salesperson's desk, like you said, that's not very captivating. But if it's like, hey, we're doing this big series and we're combining some of the best leaders in product analytics, and we want you to be part of it. And we want you to tell your story because you have this story that's worth telling. And we're going to do it in a way that's actually, going back to what we talked about earlier, like it's actually genuinely about you. It's actually this true customer story, not a case study. That becomes this thing it's almost hard to say no to, because the people who do stuff like that are the people who get promotions, they get raises, they get that recognition that they need. So the end result, I think, is that you create different types of assets, and you can launch this whole campaign and do paid media behind it. But it also helps you at the start of the process with, this is just such a great way to get people to say yes to doing videos and case studies in the first place, which is just such a hard nut to crack for so many people.
Yeah, for sure. It's just positioning them as the hero of the story. And it's funny, this was a while ago. This was probably like 7 or 8 years ago. It was a tiny payroll company in Calgary. I think they're called Avanti. I don't think they're tiny anymore. I think they're actually huge and got bought. But it's the only other customer campaign I've remembered, because they did a comic book leave behind of like their payroll heroes. So they had someone in kind of each persona, and they got animated and had their own superpowers. And like, as I'm explaining, it sounds kind of lame, but it was actually really cool.
It doesn't.
Like, I gave it to the marketing team, and they were like, we were all just jealous of how well executed this was. So I love that campaign idea, and just being creative with customer stories.
Yeah, and doing stuff like that, I mean, it's such a fun, different leave behind thing. Like when I think of what I would pick up, I'd probably pick up that over like a generic one pager. But I think also for your customers, going back to this thing of it can be hard to get people to say yes, when you can show future customers who you're trying to feature in these stories the effort that you put into this and how it's really going to build them up, you just kind of create this flywheel that helps build on that momentum, and it makes it easier, because it's just going to be a constant battle for you of trying to find, like, we always need new stories. Like we've got a million case studies on our site. Oh, well, now we're trying to make headway in the insurance industry. So do you have any insurance customers? Like it's always going to be a thing for you. So I think the more you can show your customers, here's the effort that we're putting into this, here's how it's going to build you up, it makes those people want to do this stuff, and that's just going to make your job easier. As soon as you get to the point of people wanting to be featured in your stories and you get to pick the best of the best, that's a really, really good position to be in, but not that many marketers are in that position.
Yeah, I think there's an underrated part there too of the connection you can build through it. So like, we have customers who do this really well. Like we have one who is basically doing a road show with their customers. They're just traveling all over the world, meeting their customers, filming great customer content, but also getting to know them, taking them out for dinner. Like I remember way back in the day, I did a testimonial for Vidyard, and like they came to the office, they brought a couple of leave behinds, probably cost them like $20 or whatever. But as a customer, like it makes you actually feel special. And I still recommend Vidyard to this day. They have a good product, which helps. But like that general feeling that you get from them actually caring enough goes a long way. And it's something we try to do internally with our customers as well. It's like our clients are trusting their customers with us. So in the end, we want to provide that good experience. And I think all marketers should kind of strive for that.
Yeah, you really need to think of advocacy as this journey, right? And it's doing some sort of case study or video for you is a step on that journey. It's not always the first step. Sometimes it is, but it can catapult you into doing bigger stuff, right? Like it's you do this video with them because it's kind of a favor, but they do such an amazing job and it helps you get recognition. Well, now you want to do more stuff with them, right? And you just need to think of it as this long-term journey with your customers. And hey, we don't always start at the end of the journey, right? Like sometimes we can leap ahead and sometimes that makes sense. But yeah, like having these different ways that they can, do various forms of advocacy, like there's more snackable stuff. Like I've heard it described as like low calorie and high calorie asks sometimes, but just thinking about like, how do we genuinely make this beneficial for our customers and how do we help them build their careers? And how do we think of this advocacy journey as a long-term thing where this is just a stepping stone on it? And this isn't just, hey, we got the video from them, we're good, we move on to the next person.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that low calorie, high calorie ass thing because I think that's a good way to explain it. I'm sure it's been passed down. You stole it from somebody.
I stole it from somebody. It was from a podcast that I used to host, and now I'm trying to think if it was Jane Menyo over at Gong or I'll figure it out. We'll put in the show notes or something like that because I did not come up with it. I'm not that clever. It is a good.
It is a good way to frame it though, and I think something else we kind of hinted around is like how to actually tell the customer story. And we talked a little bit about, it having to be personal, relatable, but I'm curious, having written so many of these structure-wise, like how do you think through, I guess, A, asking the right questions to get the right responses, and then B, crafting that into a story that someone will actually read and actually get through?
Yeah, so maybe I'll tackle those separately. So I think the question side of things, I think that a lot of people think that all interviewing is you just like write down the questions you're going to ask and then you go in and ask them. Yeah. And I always say, like, if our job as interviewers could have been replaced by a tape recorded version of us, we didn't do a very good job. An interview should be dynamic. It's not that you shouldn't come up with the questions ahead of time. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if you're just using them as this script that you are not going to veer off of, you're never going to go deeper, you're never going to change course as people give you different answers, I think you're not doing a very good job interviewing. I think you need to look and see where the nuggets are and know where to go deeper and where to steer away. And like, one thing I always tell like our interviewers when we're training them is like, try to figure out where people get excited and try to go deeper on that. Like maybe this was just a passing question that you didn't think there's much of, but they got so excited about that. And if they're going to get excited about it, they're going to give great answers, which is probably going to resonate with prospects. But when I think of questions, I think, there's so much general advice out there around like ask open-ended questions and things like that. And that is good advice. But I really think so much of it comes down to asking follow-up questions. I think that if you could focus on one thing to be a better interviewer, it's ask good follow-up questions. And an example that comes to mind for me is we used to have this one client where their product was a SaaS solution for bookkeepers where it used OCR technology to help where their clients would scan receipts, and instead of them manually having to enter all this information, it would just automatically, use the OCR technology, input this stuff, and so that the bookkeepers could then spend time, on less manual stuff and start, having more impactful relationships with their clients. And every story kind of started to get the same because it was like, what are the benefits? And like, I save time, and it was just that over and over again. But I remember I had this one interview that I did with she was a bookkeeper. They were all bookkeepers, but it was like a sole proprietor bookkeeper. And I asked her what the benefits she had received with the product were or something to that effect. And she said she saved 5 hours a week. Yeah. And that right there is a great ending point for a lot of people, right? Like you save 5 hours in a 40-hour week. Like that's who doesn't want to save 5 hours? But the follow-up question I asked her was, what are you now doing with that 5 hours a week?
Yeah.
And she told me that she has a young daughter at home. And now, because she's a sole proprietor and has 5 hours of her week back, she takes every Friday afternoon off and takes her daughter to the park, takes her daughter to movies. That completely changes the story. You go from this product being, it's this thing that's going to save you a little bit of time, time is money, to using this product is going to give you more time with your family. And that is a completely different story that you get to tell now. And don't get me wrong, some people are just amazing at being interviewed. Some people, like, you ask them what are the benefits and they'll say, I save 5 hours. And now with that 5 hours, I do this. But a lot of people don't go deep because they don't know what's interesting, and they just need help prodding. So I think you need to learn how to ask follow-up questions and get a bit deeper is just on the interviewing side. I think like if people could take one thing away from how to be a better interviewer, it's ask better follow-up questions. There's also this podcast. It's called The Turnaround with Jesse Thorne, and it's all about him interviewing interviewers on the craft of interviewing. So
cool. Very meta.
It's so incredibly niche. Like, it's not going to be interesting to most people, but he interviews like Larry King and Katie Couric and Jerry Springer about their interview styles and how they get stuff from people. And, you know, Larry King and Katie Couric have completely different interview styles. And so that if people are looking to become better interviewers, whether they have a podcast or you're looking to get better customer stories, I definitely recommend checking that out. But that's the first part of your question around how do we ask better questions? And then what do you do with that? I think in general, I just tell people you have to learn the principles of good storytelling, right? So when you talk about how to structure this, you know, one really common piece of advice that I hear from a lot of people is to, you know, learn Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey, right? That like we have all these different stories, but for the most part, they all kind of follow a similar structure. And I think that is great advice. And I think it's something that people should learn. But I also think people just need to take inspiration from outside of their industry. Like, I've long believed that, of course, B2B and B2C marketing are different things. Like, selling a pair of socks is not the same thing as selling a $2 million a year piece of software, but B2B has so much we can learn from B2C. And similarly, like, a lot of times people look for inspiration, like there's insurance software, again, is my go-to example. So they look for other great insurance case studies. But really what they should be doing is when they're watching a Netflix show or an HBO show, seeing what resonates with them with that and trying to bring that into their storytelling, right? So you can do like a cold open where you drop the reader or the viewer, if it's a video, like right into the middle of the story, right? Like, that's something that's like happens so often in movies and TV shows, but we almost never see it in case studies. So I think it's, you know, people can learn the overall structures with stuff like The Hero's Journey, and that's a really important starting point. But I think just in general, look around you and read books and consume stuff that's completely outside of your industry, and just have an eye of what resonates with me about this storytelling and how can I bring that into a case study, even if my audience is insurance brokers, even if they're accountants, even if they're IT managers. Because I think a lot of times people think that that doesn't resonate with those people, but the people reading these things are human beings. Like, they are not companies. Like, people buy from people, right? So I think it's just, we have to realize that people want to be entertained, and people will learn from entertaining stories. Like, we've been using storytelling to teach people things for thousands of years. So just start looking for more inspiration outside of just good case study examples or good video testimonial examples, and start trying to think of how you can craft that into what you're doing.
Nice. No, I think that's a good way to look at it, because otherwise you run the risk of just being very formulaic.
Yeah.
You know, especially if you combine those two. I'm going to read through my 12 questions that are the same every single time, and then I'm going to tell the exact same story. And then, like you said, you get the exact same story. One thing that I thought was interesting on the asking questions part is I've been through a lot of sales training over the years. It's really similar to a lot of that interview stuff you were talking about, which is kind of interesting. Like, even like you basically just asked an impact question after getting the initial feedback, right?
Yep.
So that could be another place potentially to go learn as well, is how do salespeople ask questions? How do they unpack, do kind of callbacks to those questions and ask in different ways? You're not selling something on an interview, but you kind of are. Like, you're trying to sell your credibility to get a good story out of them is the short of it.
100%. I mean, I think a lot of salespeople get a bad rap for you know the way that they approach those sales calls. But you're right. Like, a lot of that sales training of just trying to get to the underlying thing really translates to case studies and what you're trying to get out of those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm going to share the link to that interview. I'm actually going to check that out, because I interviewed Heather from our team, who interviews full time. She's very good at it.
Yeah.
And I learned a hell of a lot just from talking to her for 20 minutes. So I'll see what Larry King can teach me. So for listeners, I'll include that one. Dan, this was great. Thank you so much for sitting down, chatting about storytelling, written stories, saying that case studies aren't completely dead. If anyone wants to learn more, connect with you, where's the best place to go?
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn. I think I have the /Kalmar domain on LinkedIn. That's Kalmar,
Yeah.
but you could just Google me. Dan at testimonialhero.com. I love talking to people about customer stories. I mean, it's just been my world for the last 7 to 10 years. I've done a disgusting amount of customer stories, and with that, I've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't work. And I just want people to produce better customer stories. I think it's just such a great medium that can be really impactful, and a lot of people are doing a bad job at it, which means there's a lot of opportunity. So like, even if people don't end up, using our services at Testimonial Hero, like, just if people are going to do better customer stories, I feel like I've kind of won and done my good deed for the day. So I always love chatting with people about customer stories.
Nice. Awesome. So reach out to Dan if you want to kick around ideas for customer stories. And thanks again for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dustin.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. My key takeaway was the difference between case study and customer story. And it seems like a minor thing, but if you look at things as a case study, it becomes this checkbox. I have my case study quota. I got to hit. I got to do it the same way everyone's always been doing it. It doesn't actually work well. So just shifting the lens a bit, think about your customer stories and how you want to both tell those stories and distribute them throughout your go-to-market. If you enjoyed today's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, give a 5-star review. I really appreciate it, and it helps the podcast grow. And as always, I'll be back next Tuesday with a new episode.